Well, hey, welcome, guys. Welcome, all you wiretappers out there back here in the studio of Gangland Wire. I got another episode here that I think you'll find really entertaining and kind of go back to the roots of organized crime before there was a commission. Almost when the Mustache Pete's were just kind of a bunch of guys running around robbing all their neighbors and things like that. And the immigrant experience, because at the same time, you had this large influx of Jewish people from Eastern Europe primarily coming in the United States and all settling in basically the same neighborhoods as the Irish or Italian immigrants, and Irish were already been there for a while. They play in this too. Because you guys all know, I've said this before, by the time the Italians and the Jewish people got here, the Irish already had all the government jobs sewed up. They had the police jobs and they had the fire department jobs, and that was their way, the immigrant path. And so the Italians and the Jewish people, they have to start stores and restaurants, and because they're not going to allow them in to these existing jobs or into the trades, and so they have to scuffle for whatever they can get. So we're going to talk to a man today, Dan Slater, who has written a book about this time in New York City. It's called The Incorruptibles, the true story of kingpins, crime busters, and the birth of the American underworld. Welcome, Dan. I'm really happy to have you here.
Hello, sir. Thank you for having me.
All right. So, Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself. You've been a reporter. You've written other books, I think, but I know you've been a reporter. Tell the guys a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I actually went to law school way back when, and I got out of law school. I think I lasted for a little. I think it was less than a year. I think that I was sworn into the New York bar, and I left the profession 3 weeks later, and went into journalism. I survived there for a little while. Worked at a few different magazines and newspapers, and then I published my first book in 2013. And that was a very different book than both this book and the book that came before it. That was a book about the online dating industry. I wanted to move on, and my second book is called Wolf Boys. Wolf Boys is about young men who live in South Texas and become like assassins for a big Mexican drug cartel. And then there's this book, which is my first project that is set exclusively in the past and the deep past, more than a century ago. This is a story about the ancestors that we didn't know, the people who came kind of just before us. They were the grandparents' parents and such. And I think that's what you were getting at. You know, this is before the time when organized crime was a thing, but yet this is where it was sort of founded and established. And that's part of what got me into this book. And there are lots of reasons that I came to this subject, but what got me to the story, it was the research that I was doing on a magazine story I was working on about a gang of violent rabbis. And this was a contemporary story. It was a piece I reported over the course of a couple years. And that was a story about these rabbis who went around beating up men who had refused to give their wives a divorce. In the Orthodox religion, there's a thing called a get, and the man has to sign it to release the woman from the bonds, of matrimony. And so sometimes you get men who, for whatever reason, say, I'm not going to sign the get. Maybe they want money from the wife's family. Maybe they're just angry or whatever. There was this little circle of rabbis that had sort of anointed themselves the judges of the community. And when they had decided that one of these young husbands was refusing the get for no good reason, they would pull him into the back of a van and put a cattle taser on his testicles.
Oh.
And anyway, there's more to that story, but that was the story that I was working on reporting. Yeah. And in the course of researching that story, I thought, violence within the Jewish community. Now, as a Jewish guy who grew up in Minnesota and has now lived in the Northeast, born in 1977, these kinds of stories, these Jewish gangster types of stories, were not stories we were told in Sunday school.
Yeah.
I didn't know that existed. So that's the reason I got into that. I was looking into Jewish violence, reading about it in, the past. And in my reading, I kept coming back to New York in the early 1900s prior to World War One. And there was a Jewish underworld there that existed on the Lower East Side, and it was a significant underworld. There were lots of parts of it. It wasn't just pimps, prostitutes, the gamblers, but it was also people who poisoned horses and stuff like that. And so I was reading about that, and then I stumbled on sort of a footnote about how the uptowners, the Jews uptown, who were the wealthy Jews from the western side of Europe, they said, this is really embarrassing that our co-religionists getting this sort of attention. And it wasn't just the embarrassment, it was that at the time there was this sort of nativist movement to shut down the borders. And so the German Jewish uptowners thought, man, for the people who want to shut down the borders, the Jewish underworld is a great reason. It's a sort of validation for, the argument. So they wanted to wipe it out. Their attempt to sort of do that, to clean the Lower East Side, is the story that I tell in the book.
Interesting, and there's like a total parallel to today is Hispanic immigrants coming in and committing some kind of crime, and those are great reasons for isolationists
Right.
and people that don't want anybody else in the country to use, and they're using it all the time, and so that everything old is new again, because this has been around since then. I'll be darned, I never really.
And the interesting thing I discovered, one of the interesting things I came across was that, and again, something I did not know, that if you would have said the word ghetto prior to 1945, the word would only have a Jewish connotation. People would not associate the word ghetto with any other ethnicity or race. So that's totally different, right? I mean, and this is a word that actually goes back to the 1500s in Venice, and that's where the word emerges, and it emerges there in relation to the Jewish ghetto. So this was a word that these people actually sort of invented, and it was a concept that they invented as a result of their marginalization.
Right. And so where they would have lived there on the Lower East Side, everybody would refer to that as the ghetto at the time.
Absolutely. And at the time, that was the right thing to call it, because at the time, it was the most densely packed urban area in the world. There, like the crowding was unimaginable by 1909, 1911 was when that kind of peaked. And so with that comes an underworld. And that's the story I tell in the book.
Really? And so your book kind of starts off, a good TV mystery or TV show, cop show will always start off with a murder. And yours kind of starts off with a murder. You've just kind of touched on the underpinnings, the basis for where we got to this murder in, I believe, 1912 of Herman Rosenthal, I believe was a gambler's name. So tell us about Herman Rosenthal a little bit.
Yeah, so he was an interesting guy. He was himself an immigrant. He was a Russian Jewish immigrant who came with his family or with part of his family to the Lower East Side when he was about 5 years old. And he was always a gambler from the time he was a kid. And so he becomes a casino owner. He finally sort of moves out of the ghetto, as a lot of the casino owners wanted to do. And he got the permission he needed from the politicians to open up a casino in the 42nd Street area. And that was where everyone wanted it to be, because that's where a lot of the money was. That's where people played for a lot of money up there. So he got permission to open a casino. And then what happened was there was a reform movement that came along. And suddenly the cop that he was used to paying off was now taking his money, but also shutting him down. And so Herman got angry about that. He didn't think it was fair that you make the payoff, but then he also gets shut down and raided. So he started to talk to the press about that, which went against the rules of the underworld, right? You don't squeal, right. You don't talk to reporters, you handle it internally. That's another thing that's kind of eternal throughout these stories, right? No snitches. So Herman became a target. And that's why Herman was shot outside the Metropole Hotel on 43rd Street in the summer of 1912. And that's
Now,
the event that sort of launches the story that I'm
now
telling.
was he shot? Did the policeman, did he get himself do the shooting or get some other coppers to do that? I assume there was more than one in on the protection racket at the time in that particular area. Is probably a precinct right there. They had a
Right.
protection racket going on. Did he do it, or did he correspond and or maybe agree with other gamblers or find some kind of maybe Italian hitmen or other Jewish
It
gamblers that?
was Jewish hitmen. It was
Okay.
4 young Jewish hitmen, one of whom is an important figure in the book. And the question of whether or not the cop that was complained of had a role in the murder of this guy, that was an open thing. That was what the trials were sort of about. There was a lot of controversy there. I think if it had been certain that the cop had had a hand in it, then it would not have become the story that it did. It
Interesting.
was that sort of lingering, question. And so that becomes a big story for the next 3 years. It's on the front pages of newspapers up through the summer of 1915. During that time, that the story that I'm telling in the book sort of happens behind the scenes of that.
Now the headlines were start off with the investigation. Did somebody find these guys right away and charge them? So they had images of who did the killing and found out who they were, and that kind of stirred people up. Why did it stay in the papers for so long and they paid so much attention to it?
Because it brought out so much information. All these gamblers and people in the underworld were turning states' witnesses to evade a prison sentence, as people have always done. And all this stuff spilled into the open. And the American public was, shocked that there was this much corruption. And it just goes to show that, New York and the urban areas of America are these sort of swamps, where immigrants, come and it becomes a depraved sort of environment. That was the image that a lot of people sort of held on to dearly at the time. And here was a story that totally reinforced everything that some people had already believed.
And so the cops at the time, everything I've read about, I was looking more in Kansas City at the time, they're not going to go in and clean up, so to speak. They're not going to go in and make a lot of cases. They're not going to stop this gambling or stop this prostitution, stop this drug dealing. They just want to get a little piece of the action, usually. And so somebody, the way I looking through your book and reading through your book, the way I understand it is these uptown Jewish people decided that they would try to do something themselves. Is that how the book then
They take it upon
unfolds?
themselves, which, today, to think of it in today's terms, that's kind of a weird concept.
Yeah,
That the
vigilante.
wealthy folks in a town would be able to put in motion this private repressive police force, aka vigilantes. But at the time, it wasn't quite as weird because there were other places where that was happening, where private money was able to sort of buy law enforcement, buy the services of law enforcement. So you were taking your marching orders from the wealthy, which I guess isn't surprising. But yeah, these uptowners, the German Jews, they had been trying to eliminate the Lower East Side underworld at that point for almost a decade. And they had tried a bunch of tactics and nothing had worked. A lot of things had backfired. And so finally, now they were saying, okay, there was this murder of this Jewish casino owner. It's bringing all this attention to what we don't want attention, toward. So we got to do something ourselves. And that's when they find a young man. He's a 21-year-old who was born and raised on the Lower East Side. And he was raised, as everyone is who's born and raised down there at that time, he's raised among the underworld. It's all around him. And he has a lot of close friends that he loses to that. He's also the son of a reformer. He's the son of a pretty interesting guy who'd been a union leader in the garment unions. He'd been he was a person who's always, you know, trying to uplift and elevate the neighborhood. And his father had worked with a lot of the uptowners going back to the 1890s to try different things to sort of elevate the ghetto. But nothing had worked. And now it was 1912, and his son was now 21. And the uptowners find his son, and they say, hey, can you start to get us some information that we can actually move on and take to the mayor? The mayor goes to the police department. You know, they were essentially looking for names of the cops who were, you know, were paid off. Yeah.
They were like an intelligence unit. They were going out gathering intelligence in this closed world,
Right.
and they could move freely in this world, and with no shopkeepers and no neighbors, and they could go talk to them and say, hey, who's this guy, what's he doing? So, and then they were
Right.
putting that together into a picture of what was going on. Is that what you're saying?
So yeah, so this young man whose name was Abe, and in fact, if you give me a minute, this is Abe,
Ah,
right?
yeah.
That's him at 21, around the time that these people find him. He has a bunch of informants placed around who are reporting to him. So, and then he's also gathering information himself. Through that network, he's able to have some success in the early months of this, the end of 1912. And he does well enough with it that the mayor of the city says, I'd like to install you in, you know, the NYPD, and you have a squad, and you guys will go around and raid and run out of town all the brothel, you know, the brothel owners, the pimps, the casino owners, going through these different phases of the Jewish underworld. And that's the story of the book, is how they, you know, how they try to go about that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that was before you had all these legal niceties like the Miranda warning and that kind of thing. You know, you
There
just
was
go
none of
in.
that. Yeah, that stuff was just starting to come into being, the sort of the legal protections. And that's a theme in the book, is how those protections kind of came along, how some of them failed because of the vice laws.
Mhm.
In order to have you know, a drug war, you need to be able to put the Fourth Amendment aside every once in a while. So that those two things came into conflict in the context, I think, of the story that's in the book.
Relating to really my own experience in modern times during what we would call the crack wars of the 1980s and 90s. And I hate to say it, admitted I was one of Ronnie Reagan's soldiers in the war on drugs in those days. And you would get informants. And I was reading this in your book about people would report things about just have a name and a gun. Joe Trop, fence and gun. Carl Castle, fence and gun. And then give an address and say, you know, this is a disorderly room house, or have some names. And I used to get names from people in the neighborhood, and they would just give you these cryptic little things that they'd seen in the neighborhood, trying to let you know that this was a coke house, and this is a house that people show up once in a while, but they don't really seem to operate out of it, and those kinds of things. And you know, and I'll tell you what, they didn't care about legal niceties, those neighbors of those people. We had to care about them, but they didn't care about those legal niceties. And back then, you could get that stuff from a neighbor, an informant, and just go kick the door in and take everybody down and destroy, you know, that gambling table, just destroy the table. Is that, you know, it's a little bit different. That's how far we've come, but yet some things are still the same.
Yeah, that was it. There were a lot of people down there who wanted to see that stuff out as well. The underworld had a lot of power because it made so much money.
Yeah.
But a lot of people were afraid to confront them, were afraid to oppose them, because the Jewish underworld went back. You know, it had such a history, particularly in the place that these refugees had come from, which was the western border of Russia, the Pale of Settlement, which was another ghetto. It was a different kind of, you know, it was a different sort of ghetto, because there the geography was so large. It was the whole western border of Europe. It was like our southern border. Still, it was a ghetto. The Jews were, you know, are required by law to live there,
Mm-hmm.
and it was pretty brutal. There was a ton of oppression. There were massacres, And there was a big underworld there. There was a big smuggling underworld. There was a lot of prostitution, and in order to operate, you had to pay folks off. So that had almost become part of the culture. Like everyone just expected to pay people.
How organized were they? This Jewish underworld at the time. We know the
It was
Italians.
impressively organized.
Okay,
It
the
was
Italians are
impressively.
starting to get organized, but I didn't. And the Jewish people, the Murder Incorporated and Mayor Lansky, they'll
Yeah,
be
that's
organized,
later.
and but that comes out
That's
of this. That's got to come out of
that is
this.
later. Yeah, I am telling. Although Meyer Lansky does make an appearance toward the end of the book, as we follow the story into the 20s, the bulk of my book takes place prior to 1915.
Right. And so these
Um,
guys that you're talking about, they're forming the basis that Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel and those guys will then build on that's what we're going to learn out of your book. Is that what I hear you
a-
say?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's exactly right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so you asked about the organization of it, and this was one of the most interesting things I learned is that these different sort of areas of the underworld, like for instance, the pimps had their own association. It was like a networking group, a business group. They actually filed to be a corporation under New York state law in 1903. They
Hmm.
they filed the Constitution. They filed, bylaws that spell out things like their unemployment insurance plan, their burial plan for members, what the monthly dues were going to be. And all these pimps gathered at this cafe on Second Avenue. And that's where they hung out and played cards and did business and traded prostitutes back and forth with each other. And they had like a union. They had a company almost. So that's just one example. And there was other groups like the casino owners.
Yeah.
They had an association. And one of the big functions of the association is that people who are all involved in prostitution or people who are all involved in owning a casino, or they have to pay off a lot of people. And you don't want to make a bunch of payments, you want to make one payment. So the association would pool the payments every month, and then it would get, paid up to, to someone at the top.
So how they fit in with Tammany Hall? Did they help get the vote out? Did they get involved in elections or anything?
Yeah, so in addition to all that money, the way that you served, Tammany Hall was exactly that. You got out the vote. And it was so much so that it wasn't really even safe to vote in those years.
Hmm.
Because people there was a lot of intimidation at the polling stations. And yeah, so the democratic process itself was a dangerous thing that had sort of been taken over by the underworld. So that is yet another phase of it that the people in my book have to confront, is
Yeah.
getting the populace to vote again, to say, hey, it's okay. You don't have to pay off the gangster. You don't have to pay off the cop, and you can go to the voting booth. Like that was the fundamental rules they needed to impart.
Now, what was the primary news organization of the day? Was the New York Times? Were they going, or was it the Daily News? I can't remember. Did they really, some particular well-read paper, jump on this and get the headlines out and try to influence the city government?
Yeah, there were a ton of newspapers at the time. There was the NYT, I believe, had the largest circulation.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there were something like 14 mainstream newspapers, in addition to all the foreign language newspapers. There were a ton because there were so many immigrant groups. So on the Lower East Side, there were, I don't know how many Yiddish papers. There were a lot. There were a lot of Yiddish papers. I don't know, more than 10, at least. But the Forward was the biggest, and the Forward had a lot of power. And in 1912, the year that the story kind of kicks off in the book, the Forward built this gigantic building on East Broadway downtown, and that was the largest building on the Lower East Side for the next several years. But that just goes to show that that was a newspaper that had a lot of power. It had almost as many readers as the Times. And so it and its editor play a role in the book I'm telling.
Yeah.
In the
I
story I'm
figured they
telling.
would, but in Kansas
Yeah.
City, we had the newspapers of those times. If there looked like there was something they could dig into, they would send out like squads of newspaper reporters and just start talking to people, trying to find out what was going on, and then put it into some kind of an article with some big bold headlines, and really try to really affect public opinion. These guys were depending on the public just to keep their mouth shut and go on. Well, the newspaper can be a huge force in stirring that public opinion up against the gangsters.
Absolutely. And there were a lot of papers that just loved to write about crime.
Yeah, it sells.
So there was a lot of good coverage actually. And I had a lot of amazing sources for this book, but one of the best sources was, the newspaper archives.
Yeah.
When you have that many newspapers, you've got a lot of reporters out there in every corner writing stuff down.
Yeah.
So
and they'll get firsthand accounts of different things that'll happen that somebody else may not get, will never hit the courthouse or anything. It's a heck of a story. Now, I guess did the name Arnold Rothstein figure into any of this? He'll go on and kind of be as Italians. We mentioned Mayor Lansky before, and he's a little bit older than Lansky, I believe. He would have been a young man during this time coming up, and he'll be pretty important on organizing gambling. Along with the Italians, and more on a national basis when they have the wire service and are betting on racetracks around the country and that kind of thing. Did he come up out of this? Did you have anything about him?
Rothstein plays a big role in the book. Like the vice reformer that we follow, we also follow Rothstein from the time that he's a boy. He's kind of the flip side because he's somebody who learns to take advantage of the reformers' laws. So as we know today, anytime you ban something, you create a black market for it.
Yeah.
And someone is going to come in and serve that market. And he learned that very early on. I don't think he set out to be like a criminal mastermind. He was a gambler. He was a gambling addict from the time he was a kid. And he just lived for massive amounts of risk. And he was also very brilliant. And he's an example of someone who was really made by the times that they happen to live in. Because as all these vice laws are getting passed, it's not just that there's a crusade. It's not just that there's a war on crime. It's that the war on crime is now all of a sudden being backed by laws that hadn't before existed. Bans of alcohol, bans of narcotics, laws against prostitution. Just realize that anytime that you try to regulate something, there's going to be some money to be made. I think he understood that for the first time in 1907 or 1908, which is good more than a decade before he is later accused of fixing the 1919 World Series, which I think is the event that most people know Rothstein for. If you know Rothstein at all. I think to the older generation, Rothstein is still a known figure. I think for younger people today, even people my age, I'm in my mid-40s. If I asked most of my friends who Arnold Rothstein is, they would have no idea. I think he is a really important historical figure because all the crime narrative that we obsess over today, from The Godfather all the way through to in podcasts and film and television, all this stuff that we eat up, all these narratives we tell, it really started in this place. And it started in large part because of this one person. I think does not necessarily reflect the kind of figure that you'd imagine. If he wouldn't compare well to Vito Corleone. He would have nothing to do with Chapo Guzman. for instance. But maybe, maybe he would a little bit. He was just a guy who was a gambler. He wore a suit and he hung out in Times Square and he took a lot of meetings and he knew a lot of people. And he had a lot of money and he used that money to be kind of a bank for the underworld.
Yeah.
So anytime you needed money to do something, to go smuggle a bunch of drugs or move a bunch of whiskey during Prohibition or open a new casino or even a legitimate enterprise, you want to open a restaurant, he was someone you could go and see. And he financed from again, back, going back to the time he was a kid, he was a financier of the stuff that happened beneath the surface of legality.
Finish this off with what happened with the Incorruptibles.
Oh man, well, what happens with the Incorruptibles is it becomes a team of these young men who are paired with a very select portion of the NYPD to take down the Jewish underworld. And what happens with them is they are going to take that mission seriously, and we're going to see that fight unfold. And that is really the heart, I think, of the book is the whys and the hows of that.
All right, Dan Slater, I really appreciate you coming on. And folks, I'll have links to the book and to Dan's author page on Amazon, and so you can get his other books. If you're interested in the online dating service, why, you probably learned more than you ever wanted to know about it, Dan's book. Would you imagine?
Probably. You just might.
All right, Dan, I really appreciate
Okay.
you coming on the show. Thanks a lot.
All right, buddy. Thanks a lot.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
See you.
Bye. Well, guys, that was, I thought that was really interesting. We kind of went off a little bit from the Incorruptibles, got back to them, but the Arnold Rothstein stuff, the Meyer Lansky, and those guys that we all know, they stand on the shoulders, really, of these early Jewish gangsters. So I really appreciate Dan coming on the show. Be sure and get that book if you're interested in reading books like that. I've got a copy of it here, and I've been going through it. I haven't really had a chance to read it. And I know it's back up over my shoulder. There it is over there. I'm gonna go back and really get into it now. I just didn't take time for it. Had to make notes out of it. Anyhow, get that book. I think it's really going to be a good read if you're a serious student of organized crime in the United States. Well, this is going to get you right back to the roots of it. So don't forget, I like to ride motorcycles. Watch out for motorcycles when you're out there on the streets. And don't forget that if you have a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, go to the VA website and get that hotline. And if you have the kind of the co-problem of drugs or alcohol addiction, why, whether you've been in the service or not, and I think the VA has drug and alcohol recovery services. But if you're not a veteran, go see Anthony Ruggiano. He's down in Florida, former Gambino guy, and he's got a treatment center. He works in a treatment center down there. He's got a hotline number on his website. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and go back and look at my my older stuff. I've got a lot of stuff out there. We've got a Gangland Wire podcast Facebook page or Facebook group. It's a private group now because I got too many spammers on there. So get hold of me, and I'll send you an invite to your Facebook name. And let's see, what else have I got? Give me a review. If you're on the Apple Podcast, give me a review. All those kinds of things help. And comment. Let me know on the Facebook. I got a Facebook page too. Let me know what you want to hear, what you like, what you don't like. YouTube, you can make comments there. I see all those practically, and I answer them if somebody asks a question, if I possibly can, as long as it's a legitimate question. I get some questions aren't so legitimate on there sometimes. So anyhow, I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Thanks a lot.